This week continues with our author, Frank Zafiro. Stefan Kopriva is a disgraced police officer turned investigator. In the years since he left the police department after a terrible mistake, his life has been a slow journey toward redemption. Now, a decade and a half removed from his greatest failure, he's still not there entirely, but he is closer. In today's story, his involvement in the investigation at hand isn't something he seeks out, but a sense of duty to the victim is the underlying reason for his doing so. Kopriva's version of duty is still very guilt-driven, and so he sometimes ends up in situations he'd be better off avoiding. But life, much like he discovers, is also a true game of checkers. It isn't as simple and straightforward as we often think, or wish. Check out the Steph Kopriva stories on Frank's website and from your favorite book retailers. Welcome to Mysteries to Die For. I am TG Wolff, and I'm here with Jack, my piano player and producer. This is a podcast where we combine storytelling with original music to put you at the heart of a mystery. All of our stories are structured to challenge you to beat the detective to the solution. These are arrangements, which means instead of word-for-word readings, you get a performance that's meant to be heard. Jack and I perform these live, front to back, no breaks, no fakes, no retakes. This is Season 7, Games People Play. Games are about competition conducted according to rules with participants working toward a goal. Games are part of every culture and are one of the oldest forms of social interaction and engagement. Games can be fun, challenging, and exhilarating. They can also be intense, cutthroat, and lethal. This season, our authors have fashioned deadly games and unscrupulous villains to test your detection skills. This is Episode 6, Part 2. Checkers is the featured game. This is A Checkered Past by Frank Zafiro. All right, so we are in Part 2 of A Checkered Past. The investigator is Steph Kopriva, and he's on the case. Just a little recap from last week. So the guy that he occasionally played checkers with in the park across from his house, he's dead. Retiree Mick Darabont supposedly died from injuries occurred when he fell in his bathroom and hit his head. The police say an accident. The daughter, Lula Titan, isn't buying it. At the funeral reception, Steph interviewed Lula's brothers, Donald, the older one who at least looks like he has a lot of money. Lula said his business is bleeding. And Aaron is sort of the never quite achieved his potential, working as a, how do you say that? Coffee barista. Thank you, Jack. I know you all couldn't hear him. He cued me, barista. And then there's Mick's apprentice, Mars Claver, who it's not quite clear whether he owns the business now, whether he bought out Mick. There's a lot of mystery there. So now we pick up the story as Steph returns home after the funeral. So, Chapter 18. At home, my girlfriend Anna was still sleeping, so I didn't go into the bedroom to change clothes. Instead, I removed the tie and jacket, draping both over the back of a chair. Then I grabbed the house phone and stepped out onto the back porch. My first call was to Joel Harity, the defense attorney I worked for. Kylie answered the phone and put me through quickly. "What happens when somebody dies in this state without a will?" I asked him. "That depends," he replied, which is exactly the lawyer answer I expected. "Was the deceased married? Are there children?" "Widower," I said, "and 3 adult children." "When someone dies in state with no spouse and with children," he said, "the children inherit everything." Simple, I thought. "Equally?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Once the estate's outstanding debts are settled, the children get equal share of the remaining assets." "Can anything derail that?" I asked. "Well, a lawsuit challenging the estate disbursement could delay the process. Someone could sue for a multitude of possibilities," said Harity, "but most are quite unlikely to happen and, historically, less likely to prevail." I wasn't interested in those, at least not yet. "What are some of the more likely ones?" "Another claimant," he said. "What?" I was thinking it through out loud. "Like a secret kid?" "Yes," said Harity. or if someone were to claim standing equal to one of the existing children, say such as an illegitimate child or an adopted one. I considered that. Mick didn't strike me as the kind of man who had secrets of that nature in his background. Then again, I wouldn't have guessed he'd be so roundly despised by his own children and business partner either. All right, I said. What else? Well, financial claims against the decedent, said Harity, that weren't immediately known to the executor. So somebody shows up late to the game, saying Mick owed him money? Precisely, Harity said. I thought about that. I had no indication thus far that anything like that had occurred, but there was a lot I didn't know yet. Then another thought occurred to me. What about an ongoing business? If the details of that were snarled and murky, would that slow things up? Potentially, yes. Harity didn't hesitate. Are the heirs involved in the business directly? No, I said. They're just there to collect their piece of the pie now that he's gone. And this man's death was a natural one, he asked. Why do you ask? Because, Harity said, if he was murdered and any of the heirs are suspected of involvement, that would certainly stall matters. Chapter 19. My next call was the one I was dreading. The phone rang 5 times before sending me to voicemail. I listened to Richie Matsuda's smug voice recite his title and position and invite me to leave a message. I did as his recording asked. This is Stefan Kopriva, I said. Then I used a phrase that met with success when talking to other detectives. I'm working for a client whose case intersects with the one you're investigating. I'd like to talk to you about it. I left my number and hung up. Given our history and my reputation with the RCPD, Detective Matsuda would most likely hang up as soon as he heard my name and then delete the message. But I had to try. Chapter 20. The Oakleaf Apartments were not far from my house, located just on the other side of Pettit Drive, overlooking the valley below. The complex was newer than I expected for that part of town. It lay just north of the neighborhood commonly known as Felony Flats, though the cops still called it the Zone. Felony Flats was another patchwork neighborhood, replete with shitty rentals, contrasted with owners trying to keep things as nice as they could. Mick's apartment house was in a sort of no man's land, north of Felony Flats by a few blocks. However, the river and Pettit Drive hemmed in the homes there and kept it from being included in the much larger, more generic West Central neighborhood. As a result, they were in an area with no name. The front gate to the yard was tall and sturdy, built of wrought iron. The black spikes gave the complex a slightly sinister look, something that the peach-colored siding did little to belie. The metal entry box with the keypad stood sentry, but since the gate was open, I continued to the front door. That's where my luck failed. It was locked. I checked the directory and found the name Fred Davin with the letters MGR after it. I pressed the button and waited, peering through one of the tall, narrow windows to the side of the door. A minute passed before the apartment nearest the front door opened. A heavy-set man in jeans and a collared shirt exited, wiping his hands on a paper towel. He was barefoot and chewing something while he walked. I thought it was gum, but when he swung the door open, the smell of roasted chicken washed over me. Can I help you? You're the manager, I asked. Fred Davin? That's right. Fred stared out at me from his fat face with mild suspicion in his beady eyes. Who are you? I'm an investigator, name's Kopriva, doing some work on the McDarabont death investigation. His eyes narrowed. Cops already did that. I'm private, I said. Can I come in? Fred seemed to think it over and then stepped aside. Once I was in the hallway, he resumed wiping his fingers on the tattered paper towel he held. Do you have a warrant or something? He asked. I'm not a cop, I said. And why would I need a warrant? He shrugged. I don't know. Don't you need one to go inside his place? No, I said, not wanting to explain the intricacies of the law to him. I wasn't sure it was important to see Mick's apartment, but that was the one thing about investigations. You never knew. I could make an educated guess about what mattered most, but I didn't know what I didn't know. So looking at Mick's apartment was on my list of things to do, as well as talking to the neighbor, Sally Grayson. Whether Fred let me into the apartment or not was more a matter of convenience than anything. If push came to shove, I was pretty sure I could get Lula to escort me. Fred watched me, working the last bit of meat in his mouth before swallowing and smacking his lips. "Who are you working for?" he asked. "His daughter, Lula," I said. Normally, I kept client information confidential, but I could see that my standing with Fred was teetering on the edge of credibility and could go either way. Lula's status as a family member might solidify my position. It was the right call. At Lula's name, Fred's face brightened slightly. "Well, all right then," he said. "Let me get the keys." While he did that, I studied the board just inside the door, looking for Sally Grayson's apartment number. I found it quickly enough. She was in 3D. Mick's was 3B. Fred returned, still barefoot, carrying a key of rings. "Come on," he said. "Let's go." Chapter 21. We climbed the stairs, a process that always slowed me down. I had to take them carefully and one at a time. On smooth surfaces, my prosthetic functioned almost perfectly, but rough terrain presented a problem. So did stairs. Fred noticed my struggle and paused at each landing, waiting impatiently. At least he didn't comment on the situation, though. Mick's apartment was neat, almost Spartan. A small love seat and chair sat in the living room. The only thing on the walls were an analog clock and a framed map of Australia. No personal photos at all. In the kitchen stood a table with 2 chairs, like sentries. The countertops were empty. The bedroom was home to a narrow bed with a plain nightstand with an alarm clock and a lamp. The bed was made, the blankets pulled tight and precise. "Say what you want about the old bugger," Fred said. He'd been trailing me as I walked through the apartment and now stood in the bedroom doorway. But he was a neat sumbitch. I didn't answer. One thing was certain. If Mick was wealthy, he wasn't spending his money on an opulent lifestyle. If I'd been alone, I might have opened a few drawers and closets, but Fred's looming presence kept me from doing that. Instead, I asked him, was he a good tenant? Fred shrugged, his expression masking some sort of distaste. He was a quiet one, and he paid on time. I read into it, but you didn't like him. "I don't gotta like the residents," he said. "All I gotta do is collect the rent from them and fix things that break." "I heard from someone else," I said, "that he'd set up his checkerboard in the courtyard some afternoons. Do you ever play a game with him?" "Checkers is a child's game," Fred sneered. "Mick thought different," I said. Big surprise there. Fred's tone was sarcastic. He took a deep breath and let it out with a whoosh. "No, there are 2 kinds of people in this world. Folks who play checkers with old men, and smart people." I almost smiled at that. Chapter 22. Fred offered to escort me out, but I wanted to have a chat with someone first. He gave me a suspicious look. "Who?" I thumbed toward the next door. "Sally Grayson." Then he frowned. "Why?" "Same reason I talked to you," I said, trying to learn more about Mick. Fred's frown didn't dissipate. "Not much to learn," he grunted, "but suit yourself." He crossed his arms and watched me as I knocked on apartment 3D. When no one answered, I knocked a second time and waited a while longer. Finally, Fred said, "She has a book club sometimes, or bingo, I forget which." I slid a card in the door crack above the knob and turned to go. Fred didn't move. "I suppose you want to talk to Heidi, too." "Heidi?" I asked. "Heidi Skellige," Fred said, "in 3F. I turned my hands over questioningly. "She knew Mick as well?" Fred laughed viciously. "That old coot had flings going with both of them. I don't know if either one knew about the other." His thumb jerked toward his chest. "I don't miss a thing that happens in my building, though." "Glad to hear it," I said. I moved down the hall and knocked on 3F. I got the same responses from 3D, so I slid a card into the door crack again. "She's got a book club or bingo or whatever, too. I know it's some other waste of time," he said. "That's all I need to know." We walked down the stairs together. Fred held the door open for me, though the gesture came across as more of a good riddance than politeness. You find what you're looking for, he asked. Not yet, I told him. Okay, we're going to take a pause for a mental stretch here.
That first line was the greatest line I think I've ever heard.
The first line?
I don't know.
In chapter 18?
It was in the pre-roll, and it was something about his duty. His duty is a grievance. And all I can remember, was it grievance?
Guilt-driven.
Guilt-driven. All I can imagine is someone taking a shit and just being so disappointed in themselves.
What? How did you get there?
Duty.
You went from... Are you sure you're still not a teenager?
Imagine just... Look, I was laughing, and I really hope I'm going to have to go mute that part of my audio, because I accidentally had my mic on.
I didn't hear you laughing.
It was amazing. Imagine just being so full of...
Joy?
Not
at the
joy.
Word duty?
Oh, yeah, duty. I was more thinking of him, just like, imagine just being so disappointed in yourself, so sad. Wow, just because.
I think you took that in such a direction that Frank just utterly never meant it to go.
I know, but I don't think he meant to send me on an acoustics rant either. I feel like...
No, I'm sure he didn't mean to send you on an acoustics rant.
Yeah, so anyway, in case you wanted to know about that, that's what I was thinking about during the pre-roll.
And now I'm sure everybody will be thinking about that.
I was like tempted to interrupt and say something, and then I realized that was not the time. And I'm just very happy I could remember this line. Because a lot of times you say something funny at the author writes, but it's at the beginning of like a section, and then we don't stop until the deliberation. So I have to remember it the entire time. And if anything else distracts me, I'm done.
With the first part of a checkered past and this one, I've inserted these little breaks, and I kind of like them. I think it kind of
get all the talking out.
I think we're going to start doing this as a regular feature.
Bueno.
Before we pick it back up, I did want to note that Mysteries to Die For remains ad-free. In exchange for not tempting you with game apps that numb your little gray cells, support our authors by checking out their backlists and picking up a title. This week it's Frank Zafiro. His website is in the show notes. All right, chapter 23. I stood at my front window, drinking a late afternoon coffee and staring across the street at where Mick used to sit most mornings. A few of those mornings, I'd join him. The sum total of my experience with him lasted only a few months, but I felt like I'd come to know him during that time. The view I had of the man was vastly different than the one his family held, or that of his business partner, and they had most of a lifetime to develop their opinions. Whose was more accurate? Who was he, really? Before I could go too far down that rabbit hole, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. When I answered, a woman's voice butchered my last name. "This is Steph," I said. "Who's this?" "Well, you left me your card," she said. "My name is Sally Grayson." Chapter 24. I know you like those short ones. Sally Grayson buzzed me into the building. I managed to slip past Fred Davin's door without him noticing, or at least he didn't open up and confront me. I made the laborious climb up the stairs to the third floor. I passed Mick's apartment and stopped at 3D. When I knocked, Sally Grayson answered almost immediately. She was a slender woman in her early 70s with shoulder-length hair colored a lustrous gray. Her blue dress was both casual and stylish at the same time, with lace edges along the low collar. "Mr. She hesitated before trying my last name again. "It's Steph," I said, holding out my hand. Sally smiled and shook it. "Please come in." Her apartment was neat and had a homey feel to it. A few knickknacks adorned various surfaces, many of which were tasteful, androgynous sculptures of nudes. She had a few family photos hanging on the walls, along with a couple of paintings in the same vein as the small sculptures. "Shall we sit?" Sally asked, motioning to a pair of chairs in her living room. I thanked her and we sat. Sally folded her hands in her lap and looked at me, waiting. "You called the police?" I asked. She nodded. "When I didn't see Mick for a couple of days, I got worried. He was down in the courtyard every day during good weather, setting up his checkerboard and reading until someone dared to challenge him." "Did you ever?" I asked, wanting to start with a comfortable topic. "How do you think we met?" she asked slyly. Although I'll admit, I wasn't very interested in board games. I liked the smile in her eyes. So what were you interested in? Him, of course, Sally smiled. He liked to seem a curmudgeon, and maybe he was a bit of one, but he was a handsome man. You too? I trailed off. We were friends, she said, and a little more at times. Confirming Fred's intel, did you spend much time together? I asked. Oh, an evening or two a week, said Sally. Sometimes we'd go out to a restaurant, other times I'd cook for him. We'd stay in and watch a movie. I gentled my voice. And when was the last time? She took a deep breath and let it out. Almost a week before he died. I made pork chops, and we watched Chinatown. She smiled sadly. Great film, and one of the few Mick didn't bark about the mistakes in it or how stupid it was. We did that for, well, over a year now, maybe closer to 2. I nodded slowly. It sounds like you were his girlfriend. Her sad smile broadened. The closest thing he'd allow, yes. Is it all right if I ask you a couple difficult questions, Sally? She waved a hand. Of course. I might be old, but I'm not made of tissue paper. I didn't think you were, I said. Can you think of anyone who might want to hurt Mick? Want to? She sniffed. Any of his ungrateful, selfish children probably wanted to every day of their miserable lives. But would they? She shrugged, looking doubtful. Mick was an intimidating force. Somehow I don't see either of those boys standing up to him. And the daughter? She'd get somebody else to do her dirty work. So you met the kids? I asked. She shook her head. I only knew them from what little Mick had said, but over the course of a couple years, I got a pretty good picture of who they are. She peered more closely at me. Do you really think someone did this? I was under the impression the police had determined it was an accident. That seems to be the official view, I said. I'm just following up. For the daughter, Sally said. Disapproval rang in her voice. Reluctantly, I nodded. She is my client, yes. I thought so, Sally said, disapproval in her voice. I saw the two of you at the memorial service. Are you involved with her? No, I said. In fact, I never met her before that day. Sally tilted her head in confusion. I met Mick at the park, across from my house, I explained. We played a few games. She nodded understandingly. So your loyalty is to Mick, or to his daughter? To the truth, I said. Now, what about his business partner, Mark Clavers? Sally wrinkled her nose. Imagine going through life with that name. Sort of sets you up to be a serial killer or a mortician, doesn't it? I flashed to something similar that Lula had said. Did you ever meet him? I asked. Just once, she said. He was visiting Mick about a year ago. He struck me as the sniveling type. Not as someone who might want to hurt Mick, I asked. Please, she scoffed. He was so intimidated by Mick, he was afraid of the man's shadow, much less Mick himself. If you actually think someone did this on purpose, I believe you can safely cross Mars Claver off your list. I leaned back, crossing my arms. If I remove him and the children, I'm all out of suspects. Her eyes twinkled mischievously. Maybe it was a jealous woman, she said. Not you, I said. Of course not, she put her hand to her chest. But the harlot down the hall was certainly chasing him. Chapter 25. Heidi Skillage answered her door in a satin robe, holding a drink in one hand. The off-white of the material stood out against her tan skin. She was more full-bodied than Sally Grayson and looked about 10 years younger. Her hair hung almost to her shoulders, styled in a peekaboo wave. Her eyes had a cunning element to them, but they were slightly unfocused at the moment. I know you, she said, her thick and borderline slurred words. We've never met, I held out my hand. I'm Stefan Capriva. Heidi didn't take her eyes from my face. She shifted her glass to her left hand and reached out to shake mine. Her fingers were cool and damp. I've seen you before, she said. I'm sure of it. I was at Mick's memorial, I told her. Ah, she wagged a finger at me. That was it. She took a sip of her drink, making the ice cubes clink against the glass. Still, Her eyes never left mine. When she swallowed, she turned over her hands. Well, what can I do for you? Mind if we talk inside, I asked. Sure, why not? She stepped aside so I could enter. Her apartment was as clean as Sally's, but much more disorderly. A red blanket sat on a white leather couch. A muted television played an old black and white movie I didn't recognize. On the coffee table sat a small plate with a few crumbs and a half-empty bottle of vodka. Heidi sat down on the couch atop the red blanket. There was nowhere else to sit, so I lowered myself onto the other end of the couch. She let out a short burst of laughter. Ha ha! You're a careful one, aren't you? How so? I asked. She put her glass on the coffee table and refilled it, taking your time sitting down, like maybe there's a landmine under the cushion. I've got an injury to my leg, I explained. Oh, we all do, honey. Comes with the mileage. She finished pouring and capped the bottle. But I noticed you picked a spot as far away as you could. Is that because of your injury, too? Just being polite, I said. Seems impolite from where I sit. She shrugged. But whatever. Manners have gone to hell in this world anyway. I nodded, whether I agreed or not. Mick would agree with you? He can't, said Heidi. He's dead. She let out another bark of laughter and took a drink. How close were you two? I asked. A sly smile creased her lips. Honey, we were as close as any two people can get, on many occasions. She narrowed her eyes. But who are you to ask me that? I'm looking into the situation for the family, I said. Looking into, she frowned. For the daughter, you mean? She went straight to Lula. I thought that was interesting. Why do you think so? I asked. Because she's a schemer, Heidi said. She jabbed her drink toward me, sloshing the contents. Believe me on that one, I know the type. She chuckled as she pulled the glass back toward herself. Hell, I was the type, if you want the truth. When did you last see Mick? I asked. Wouldn't you like to know? Heidi gave me a mysterious smile and took a sip of her drink. I would, actually, I said. I'm trying to figure out what happened on his final day. That's a job for the cops, isn't it? I nodded, but it's mine, too. Well, aren't you the important one, then? Her velvet tone had a sarcastic bite beneath it. But what good will it do? You going to bring Mick back to life? No, I admitted. That's right, she said. So what's the point? The point? I kept my voice calm. When I was a cop on patrol, I dealt with drunk people all the time. It seemed like almost everyone on the graveyard shift had either been drinking or was on drugs. Inebriated people could be set off for little or no reason, so I learned to at least avoid giving them that little one. A measured way of speaking to them always seemed to be the best approach, but the reality was that it could also end up being the little thing that tipped them over. I suppose the point is knowing, I said. If Mick was murdered... Heidi's sudden burst of laughter cut me off. Murdered? She cackled. Oh, you've got some grand ideas, don't you? She shook her head. The man was 75. People that old, and younger, die all the time. True, I admitted. I just don't know if that includes Mick or not. Of course it does. Heidi took another slug from her vodka, nearly draining the glass. When she tilted her head, she asked, So, how'd you know about me anyway? Mick and I kept things on the sly. Fred Davin knew, I said. She waved a hand dismissively. Creeper probably got his jollies with an ear pressed to the door. So he's the one who told you? Sally Grayson mentioned you as well, I said. A cruel smile lighted her lips. Did she now? That figures. She fancied herself as something special to Mick. It sounds to me like the two of you are in competition for him, I said. It wasn't a competition, honey. Believe me. Her expression turned wistful. It is funny, though. When you're young, it's mostly the boys competing for the girls. Or, at least, it wasn't my case. All my life, I had my pick of them. And then we get old and the men die off first. Suddenly it's the other way around and all the hens are fighting over just a few remaining roosters. Are you saying that Sally wasn't Mick's girlfriend? Girlfriend? Oh, hell no. She touched her chest with the glass tumbler in her hand. I was his girlfriend. She was the side piece, at best. She broke into laughter again. A real Sally on the side piece. I rose slowly from the couch. Thanks for chatting with me, Miss Scalige. Heidi didn't bother to stand. Got what you needed? I think so, I said, waiting with that air of politeness she claimed was dead. Well, that makes one of us. She reached for her television remote. I didn't answer. Instead, I gave her a brisk nod of farewell. By the time I reached the door, the sound from the movie had resumed. I let myself out, pulling the door firmly shut. Then I tackled the stairs again. Going down was actually more difficult than up. By the time I was at the bottom, I was glad to see a stretch of flat ground. As I neared the building's front door, Fred's door popped open. What are you doing back here, he asked. Just following up on something, I said, not breaking stride. Following up, huh? He watched me for a couple seconds. When I pushed the exterior door open, he said, Tell Lula I said hello, okay? There was a trace of pleading in his voice. I paused, glanced over my shoulder at him, and gave him a curt nod. Then I left.
Ew, that's gross.
Chapter 26. I was home again, standing at my window, drinking another cup of coffee, and mulling over the case when a knock came at my back door. Given the time, I knew it had to be Clell, one of my only friends. The heavy-set security guard often worked nights at different buildings downtown and would stop by my house for a cup of coffee on his way in. It's open, I hollered. The kitchen door rattled open and I heard Clell come in. Without needing to ask, he got himself some coffee and joined me at the window. I glanced over at him. He wore a powder blue uniform of the security company he worked for. His mustache drooped well past the corners of his mouth, but was neatly trimmed off his lip. His kind eyes watched me. You working something? He said. No hint of a question in his voice, which means I totally read that wrong. You're working something, he said. No hint of question in his voice. Sort of, I said. You don't look like it's sort of bothering you, Clell observed. Boy, I'm having trouble with this passage. I chuckled at how much he saw. How much time have you got? He glanced at his watch. About an hour before I need to get headed. I told him everything. Clell listened without comment, as was his habit. He sipped the coffee while I spoke. By the time I finished, he took both of our cups back to the kitchen for a refill. When he returned, he said, Whole lot of possibility, sounds like. I nodded. Almost everyone I spoke to hated the man. And that doesn't jibe with how you knew him, he said, correct? Not at all. I took a drink of the hot liquid, felt my throat and belly warm from it. He was gruff, but not a hard man like they described. I guess we're all different people to different people, Clell observed. I had to run that through my mind a second time to get his point. Or maybe we change and no one notices. We've already made up our mind about who we are and can't see anything new. Could be that too. Clell slipped from his mug. You think one of them did it? Well, they all had some motive or another, I said. Even the two women he was seeing did, though that's probably a stretch. Besides, motive is far from murder. As for access, no one of them could get into his apartment unless he let them in. And Fred probably would have seen them come anyway. I recall his brag about his own vigilance. Then my eyes narrowed. What is it? Clell asked. Maybe nothing, I said, but the way his face lit up when I first mentioned Lula. And then, on my second trip, he asked me to say hello to her. Clell tilted his head. You don't think, I finished the sentence, that the woman who hired me might have been the one to kill him? There's only one way to find out. Chapter 27. Lula gave me a knowing smile when she answered the door. I knew you'd be back, she said, waving me inside. It just takes some birds a little while to work up the courage to say yes. I'm not here for that, I said. I stopped in the foyer and didn't go any further. She affected an exaggerated pout. No? What then? Why did you hire me? I asked. To find out which of those bastards killed my father. Not good enough, I thought. Why? She tilted her head. What a strange question. I pressed again. Humor me with an answer. All right. Lula pursed her lips in thought, and then she said, I suppose it was because that detective wasn't going to. Why did you want it done at all? I asked. She put her hand to her chest. Are you really asking me why I'd want my father's killer brought to justice? You hated him, didn't you, Lula? She stared at me for a moment. Yes, she admitted. Of course I did. But he was my father. Fred says hello, I said, springing the information on her without a segue. Lula was good. She masked her reaction well. Fred, she asked. The super at Dad's apartment? I'm glad you remember him, I said. He certainly remembers you. A coy smile touched her lips. Well, I am memorable, aren't I? I figure it went one of two ways, I said. Maybe you can clear up for me which it was. What are you talking about, she asked, still playing innocent. The easiest explanation is that you rang your dad's apartment and he buzzed you in. I shook my head. But I don't think it was that. I think you worked a little magic on Fred and he let you in, which makes him a bit of a loose end, doesn't it? Lula stared at me for a full 10 seconds before she started laughing, and once she started, she couldn't stop. The fit started to taper off at one point, and then she glanced at me and started laughing again. I waited patiently for it to subside, and then I said, Your father's murder isn't a laughing matter. No, she said, wiping her eyes and sighing, but you thinking I had anything to do with it is ridiculous. I stood firm, not from where I'm standing. She smiled. Then I suppose you're not as smart as I thought you might be. Are you going to tell me you never flirted up Fred? Oh, no, you're right about that, she said. I gave the sad sack the best 2.5 minutes of his sorry life, but not so that I could kill my father. Why then, I demanded. To get into the apartment, she said. To look at everything before anyone else. I narrowed my eyes. You were looking for money? I said incredulously. I was looking for anything that would help my standing, she admitted. I thought of the bare apartment. What did you find? Nothing. She looked me up, down, then opened her front door. The same thing you turned out to be, she said, motioning me to leave. You're fired, by the way. Chapter 28. I returned home and found myself standing at the window once more, nursing another cup of coffee, staring at the empty bench where Mick and I used to sit. Despite the fact that my hiring was questionable, and my firing therefore barely necessary, I felt a lingering sense of failure. I'd worked cases before with no satisfying conclusion, so I was a realist about the possibility of the outcome. It happened more frequently than people who watch TV detectives might want to believe. But the personal nature of the case caused the result to hang over my head. Mick's death was still unresolved. I considered continuing to look into it on my own, perhaps as a favor to my fleeting friend, but he hadn't asked me, and I thought I knew what he might say about my sense of debt to him. Nobody owes anybody anything but the truth, he said to me just months before, and sometimes not even that. I returned to the kitchen and dumped out the rest of my coffee, my stomach in knots. Chapter 29. The phone call came the next morning. I was standing at the window once again, coffee cup in hand, looking at the empty bench in the park. I was about to wander over and sit down when my phone buzzed. Hello? This is Detective Matsuda, Matsuda said bluntly, returning your call. Surprised, it took me a second to react. Matsuda was in no mood for delays. So what the fuck do you want? I cleared my throat. Like I said, I'm working for a client whose case... Which case? He snapped. Mick Darabont, I said. The old guy in the bathroom? Matsuda sounded genuinely surprised. Who's your client? I'd prefer to discuss all of this in person, I said. And I'd prefer to be dating Kate Upton, said Matsuda. And then there's all those people in hell clamoring for ice water. I pressed my lips together. Matsuda's time working with the crusty old detective Jack Stone had certainly rubbed off on him. I just need about 10 minutes, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Matsuda hesitated. Are you still working for Harity? Yes, I said. There was another pause, followed by a long sigh. Fine, I'll be free in 30 minutes. Where, I asked. You want to meet me for coffee? Hell no, Matsuda snapped. I don't want to be seen with you. We car-side. At the arena. All right, Jack, we have reached the deliberation.
What? How have I done 2 episodes of getting information and have no idea?
Okay. I have a brief synopsis for you.
Go for it.
Steph Kopriva isn't just working a case, he's working for the truth for his checker-playing friend, Mick Darabont. He needs our help, Jack's your help, to shift through the truth, lies, and distortions. Here are the people that Steph's met in the order that he met them. Lula Titan, nee Darabont, the daughter who held a grudge. Donald Darabont, the oldest, who always needed Daddy's approval. Aaron Darabont, the youngest who was blamed for his mother's death. Mars Claver, the apprentice who is treated more like an indentured servant. Sally Grayson, the nice lady from next door who is Mick's kind of girlfriend. And Heidi Skellige, the cougar from the other next door who is Mick's other kind of girlfriend. All right, so here's what Steph's working with. Mick Darabont died in his bathroom. The official disposition is that he fell, hit his head, and died. Mick left no will. Mick Darabont was reputed to be a tyrant at work and at home. Though reportedly having money, he lived in a simple apartment and had the only key. State law will divide the estate equally among the children unless extenuating circumstances change the rules. 2 words that are easy to say back to back. Daughter Lula Titan is raising doubts. She has no proof other than her father is dead and people hated him. Donald, the eldest, owns a business that Lula says is struggling. His house was on the better side of nice. Aaron, the youngest, is a free spirit who is totally happy with his barista lifestyle. Lula, the middle child, is either revered or despised by others. The latter see her as conniving and sneaky. Mars Claver was the faithful employee who worked himself tirelessly for an ungrateful Mick. He has no respect for Lula. Sally and Mick were good friends with benefits. For years, she cooked dinner and they watched movies several times a week. She did not appreciate Heidi nosing in. Heidi and Mick were the real deal, according to Heidi, and Sally was the other woman. Sally shared that all 3 of Mick's children were selfish and ungrateful. She didn't think his sons would kill him and thought Lula would hire somebody else to do it. Sally shared that Mars Clavers was very intimidated by Mick. She said no way would he kill Mick. The apartment manager, Fred, did not like Mick, but that wasn't his job. He confirmed that Mick was with both Sally and Heidi. Fred was on Team Lula. All right, Jack, it's your move. What is the truth behind Mick's death?
Colonel Mustard.
With the candlestick?
Yeah, actually a lead pipe, because, look.
It was the bathroom, so there would be lead pipes.
Exactly. Also, he would die eventually of breathing in lead pipe. I imagine he just put it to his mouth and played it like a didgeridoo.
I hate the sound of that thing.
I love it. Man, I have no idea. Like,
can you eliminate anybody? Or can you...
Okay. It wasn't Fred.
Okay, so how do you think he died? How do you think that Mick died?
I guess I didn't consider that. I figured he was just pushed.
Okay.
He hit his head on a sink. He could have hit his head on anything.
Yeah, I think they said it was the sink.
Yeah, so they could have pushed him against the sink. Someone could have thwacked him on the head. Anyone could have thwacked him. I suppose if the old ladies did it, they would probably have had to have pushed him. Heidi might have the ability to swing something at him, but probably not Sally if she's like 70. Okay, I don't think it's Aaron, because we just don't... It's never the person you don't hear enough of. I'm going to game that. You know, he had one little interaction. He was clearly blamed for his mom's death, but there's no reason for him now to act on it when his dad is 70 years old and he's about to risk getting all money as he's a poor barista. The motive doesn't make sense for Aaron to have done it.
Okay.
I don't think it's Lula for just on intuition, I don't see a benefit of her bringing a detective in on a murder she committed when no one was suspecting it was murder. If someone's going to suspect it's murder and you want to bring the cop in because you think by bringing them in it will make you innocent, or at least look innocent, then that's a reason to do so. I don't think Lula has a reason to bring an investigator in on herself unless she wanted to be caught.
That's a good point.
Which doesn't make sense to me, so I don't think it's Lula.
I was about to say that there's plenty of stories where the guilty party brings the cop in.
Yeah.
But you're right that those situations, generally, there is already an air of murder, and this one did not have that.
This did not have it. There's no benefit to bringing someone in like that. The oldest... Donald, he loved his dad. Maybe that's just a good cover for, why he didn't do it.
There wasn't any evidence that
there wasn't
Aaron or Donald were anywhere near the apartment. There's just, whatever Lula did with Frank.
Yeah.
Yuck.
Ew. So, that being said, I've eliminated all suspects.
So you're saying that it was a natural death?
No, it couldn't have been a natural death. This is a murder mystery. This isn't the anything but murder season. Anything but murder, the crime is natural causes. I don't know if that'll be an allowed death cause, but...
We haven't made the rules yet.
Or not death cause, mystery cause. But anyway, so it was probably one of the old ladies because I don't think... Because all of them have different motive. I don't see one of them where the motive crosses, where Heidi or Sally could get some of the inheritance, or that one of the kids wants the same attention. Oh, maybe it's that.
So unlike our last episode where it was more or less a conspiracy murder, you're not seeing that this time.
No. Oh, it could. You're thinking it's more than one person?
No, I'm not. I'm just remembering the recording that we did of Hard Scrabble. I don't want to give too much away in case people haven't listened to that episode yet, but it was straightforward and complicated at the same time.
I'm going to stay away from conspiracy. If it is a conspiracy, congrats, Frank, you beat me, because those are too hard for me to want to think about. Because then there's like, the problem with that is that it's easy when you have to pick one killer. It's hard when it's a conspiracy because you don't know if it's going to be 2 killers or 3, and you just don't know how far to take it. Oftentimes, at least that's the problem I had, especially with Hard Scrabble. I had that same problem of I didn't know how many suspects to pin it to. I'm gonna stay away from that and say it was one of the old ladies, probably Sally. Heidi seems like she would be more capable of doing it, so I'm gonna say it's not her because why not? I'm going with Sally's the murderer.
All right, I hope everybody out there, all my listening detectives, you've lodged your own guess about what's the truth behind Mick's death. I want to do a quick reminder that the print books and ebook companions to the last several seasons are available from online retailers. And part 1 for this season, called Opening Gambit, was released March 19th, 2024. Buy one for you and one for a mystery lover you love. The dimes and quarters from the book sales do support the podcast and keep Jack in chocolate bunny ears and marshmallow chicks that he likes to put in the microwave. All right, Chapter 30. The River City Veterans Memorial Arena was located just north of downtown, only a block away from where the Looking Glass River cut through the city center. I used to come to hockey games here once in a while, until a case involving one of those hockey players soured me on the sport. I was glad to see the name of the building remained unchanged. Naming rights for arenas was all the rage these days across the country. The practice was becoming prominent in River City as well. Several downtown concert venues had already traded the historic monikers for temporary corporate ones. I hated it. Bank of America Hall didn't have the same ring to it as River City Music Hall. It felt like surrendering tradition and history for a few dollars, which, I suppose, was exactly what it was. And it was only a matter of time before the crown jewel of the city succumbed to the inevitable and became Cocoa Bits Arena or something equally ludicrous. These are the thoughts that pervaded my mind while I waited for Richie Matsuda. I'd found an empty quarter of the massive parking lot and backed in. On the far side, a smattering of cars were clustered around the park and ride station. but the parking area was otherwise barren. That made it easy to see Matsuda's unmarked detective car when he pulled off of Boone. He drove a Chevy Impala instead of the much larger Ford Crown Victorias that had been the department's staples for decades. According to Anna, the transition started from the top down, moving slowly as they cycled vehicles out. It figured that major crimes would be among the first detectives to make the shifts. Matsuda slowly rolled into the lot as if searching for me. Then the car surged forward, and he pulled in my direction. I lowered my window as he approached. Matsuda pulled his car in, nose first, putting our driver's side windows directly across from each other. It was a meeting maneuver long employed by cops everywhere, the term usually called car side or roadside. "Thanks for coming," I said, though the words made my stomach burn. Matsuda put his car into park. "Don't thank me. Thank Ray Browning for teaching me that professional courtesy is part of the code of ethics for a homicide investigator. That courtesy, unfortunately, extends to defense attorneys." He eyed me with disdain. "And their underlings," he added. I clenched my jaw but didn't bite on the insult. I was certain that if Detective Browning knew I was the recipient of his courtesy, he'd have told Matsuda to skip it. "You've got the Darabont case?" Matsuda nodded. "It was one of mine, yeah." "Was?" I repeated. Did I stutter or something? I leaned my head back against the seat rest. "You know, since you decided you were going to do this, it'd probably be easier for both of us if you weren't a dick about it." Matsuda glared at me. "You're lucky I'm even here." "Then let's get you gone sooner," I said. "What did you mean by was?" "It's a closed case," Matsuda said. That surprised me. Lula made it sound like it was an active investigation. "That was fast," I said. "You would think so," Matsuda scoffed. "This was a straightforward, accidental death. Guy slipped getting out of the shower and cracked his head on the sink." "How'd he die?" I asked. Matsuda shook his head. "I just told you." "No, I mean, what was the cause of death?" "Blunt force impact," Matsuda said through clenched teeth, "to the front of his skull, by hitting the sink, when he fucking fell." He leaned toward the window. "Are you trying to say I screwed up the case somehow?" I raised my hands in a calming gesture. "Not at all. I'm just asking questions." He backed off. "Why don't you get a copy of a report then?" "I probably will," I said, "but this is faster." Matsuda shook his head in disgust. "Always trying to skirt the system, just like your boss." "Or maybe," I said, "I respect the opinion of the investigator enough to seek it out." "Maybe go fuck yourself, Kopriva." "Was the apartment secure?" I asked, ignoring the barb. "When the patrol first got there, was it locked up?" Matsuda stared at me as if trying to figure out why I'd asked that question. He finally nodded. "It's a third-floor apartment," he said, "and the front door was locked when patrol arrived." "Who called?" I asked. Matsuda's frown deepened. "A neighbor called it in, Sally Grayson. She hadn't seen him in a couple of days." "And the place was definitely locked up when patrol arrived?" "Yes," Matsuda said. "The on-site managers let the officers in. They found him and called me. I investigated and closed the case." "You didn't expect or suspect foul play?" I asked. He sniffed disdainfully. "Of course I did. Every death is a homicide until proven otherwise. You'd know that if you'd ever been a real cop." I clenched my teeth and let another insult pass. "His kids all seem to have motive for seeing him dead," I said. "Sure they do. They all hated him," Matsuda shrugged. "So did his business partner for that matter, but there's no evidence of murder." "You checked them all out?" He scowled at me. "Yeah, dipshit, I did. Everyone had an alibi. Not that they needed one. The evidence at the apartment was straightforward." He peered at me closely. "I worked dozens of death scenes. This was one of the most open and shut I've ever seen. So why are you trying to stir up trouble over this?" "I'm not," I said. "Someone is," Matsuda said. "Probably the daughter, if I had to guess." "She worked the super so she can get into the apartment before anyone else," I told him. "Doesn't surprise me," he said. "That one's slippery." "You don't think that's suspicious?" I asked. "No. I think it's greedy." He shrugged. "All of them struck me that way." "But you're certain none of them killed him?" "I didn't say that." He frowned. "Look, certainty is an illusion. Could someone have pulled off the perfect crime and made it look like an accident?" He shrugged. "Sure. but the odds that they'd manage it without making a mistake that someone like me would find aren't good. Most people who think they've pulled off the perfect crime screw it up 6 ways from Sunday. And you were looking, I prodded. He scowled again. I'm always looking. It's how I was trained. Death investigations aren't traffic stops. There are no routine ones. What about the neighbor he was seeing, I asked. Sally or Heidi? Maybe one of them got jealous. He smirked. And what? Magically beamed inside his apartment, shoved him, and beamed out again? He shook his head. The deadbolt was locked from the inside. It takes either a key or someone inside the apartment to do that. Someone could have always made a key on the sly, I suggested. Ah, Christ. He put his car into reverse but didn't move yet. You want to talk yourself into a conspiracy theory? Go right ahead. But you said there was a possibility. I trailed off to see how he'd complete the sentence. Possibilities are for defense lawyers, Matsuda snapped. I deal in facts that are supported by evidence, and the evidence in this case says an old man fell, getting out of the shower, hit his head, and died. Sometimes it's that simple. Don't try to make it more complicated than it is. I dropped my eyes, staring down at my hands. I knew he was right. The world was a messy place that didn't always make sense, or even fit with what we might expect. Was he your friend or something? Matsuda asked. I nodded dumbly. Something like that. Well, you're probably his only one, Matsuda said. Aside from the 2 old ladies on his floor that he was bouncing between, no one liked the guy. He was quiet for a moment and then added, but I guess you know what that's like. His voice had lost some of its rancor, but none of its coldness. When I looked up, he'd already turned away to look over his right shoulder. He gunned the engine and backed away, the transmission whining in protest. I watched him go. Once his car disappeared onto Boone Avenue, I sat alone in my car for a while, staring at the large sign for the arena. I didn't want to leave yet, so I tried to get a handle on what I thought and what I felt. In the end, both were as simple as Mick's death had been. What I thought was Detective Richie Matsuda was right. Lula got into the apartment after her father died to get a jump start on the competition for his assets. That was all. She brought me into the situation to see if she could stir up some trouble, maybe even cast enough of a shadow on one of the other heirs to increase her own stake. It was a cold, calculating move, but that certainly fit with what I'd seen of her. As to how I felt, that was a confusing jumble of emotions. I felt frustrated, sad, unsatisfied. I reached for the gear shifter, wondering if I actually had wished that Mick's death had been a murder so that I could do something about it. If that were the case, what did that make me? Selfish? Something worse? I didn't know. All I knew for certain was that I'd never play another game of checkers. Unlike what most everyone said when it was brought up, it wasn't a child's game. No, for me, it was now like hockey, something I once enjoyed, but never would again. I had Mick to thank for that. Hell, maybe it was a good thing. Despite the man's wisdom, I think he was wrong about checkers. In the end, it really was a simple game. The problems only began once I tried to make it into a more complicated game than it actually was. Thinking a thing is something doesn't make it so, no matter how hard we think or how much we want it to be true. God damn it, I muttered. Then I slid the car into gear and pulled away. The end. Well, what'd you think, Jack? It was a natural death.
Damn it, Frank.
You were so very close. I admit I was trying to nudge you toward but how could somebody get in there?
I don't know. He could have let someone in, but then how could they have gotten out and locked it? They could have taken the key. Where was the key? I don't know. I don't know.
In prepping this, I read this story like 3 or 4 times. I was convinced Lula did it. I was convinced that, that she seduced Frank and made a copy of her dad's key, and she was the one going in and out. I totally had her doing it. I was wrong.
Damn. Well.
That was a lot of work that Steph did for a
nothing.
Natural death, yeah.
I didn't even get paid for it.
No, he didn't.
I am very mad at you, Frank. How dare you make the answer nobody did it, okay?
He's not mad. You've heard him on his acoustic
I'm livid.
rant.
I am tearing apart the studio right now out of anger. There are lamps being thrown at walls. No, there's not. Anyway.
No, there's not. And if it did, he'd put up enough soundproofing that you wouldn't hear it anyway.
That's fair enough.
Do you want to learn about checkers?
I would love to learn about checkers.
According to the website Wonderopolis, checkers is much older than the more sophisticated chess, with the game being mentioned in the writings of Homer and Plato. Historians currently date checkers back to an archaeologic... Oh man, I can't read what I wrote. Back to an archaeologist's find in the ancient city of Ur in Iraq. This dates to some 3000 BC. And in the 12th century, the French had the idea of playing checkers on a chessboard. With the updated design and accompanying rules, the game migrated to England and then outward. This game was old, and it traveled the globe, not gold, globe. It should be no surprise that it has many names and many variations. Wikipedia has an extended citation on the game, the boards, and the pieces. Even the size of the boards change. An 8x8 board is common, but 10x10 and 12x12, that's the number of squares, not number of inches, are used too. Given the rich history and complexity of this simple game, Mick Darabont may have been right. So links to those two references are in the show notes. And then let me tell you a little bit more about our author, Frank Zafiro. Frank writes gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge. During his life, he has been a military intelligence linguist, a police officer with a 20-year career, retiring as a captain, and an independent consultant and instructor. He has taught both writing and police-related topics at the collegiate level and professional venues. Through it all, he has been a writer. To date, Frank has published 48 novels and over 100 short stories and appeared in over 50 anthologies. He lives in Redmond, Oregon, with his wife, Christy, who is a teacher. So that wraps up this episode of Mysteries to Die For. Support our show by subscribing, telling a mystery lover about us, or giving us a 5-star review. Check out our website, tgwolff.com/podcast, for links to this season's authors, or this author's season. Mysteries to Die For is hosted by TG Wolff and Jack Wolff. A Checkered Past was written by Frank Zafiro. Music and production are by Jack Wolff. Episode art is by TG Wolff. Join us next week for Toe Tag. As you all know by now, it's a first chapter and a fresh release in the mystery, crime, or thriller genre, and then come back in 2 weeks for our next original story, Death of a Dungeon Master by Erica Obey, where Dungeons & Dragons is the featured game. All right, Jack. Floor is yours. Take us out.